Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today we have a very interesting person who you may or may not have heard of. His name is Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And we're going to learn a little bit more about him today. And why I say a little bit or a snapshot, because this man is so prolific that we could spend hours talking about him, as well as seeing different videos that he's done, different lectures and different programs throughout his tenure. So today we're going to take a snapshot. And if you don't know him, you will. And if you do know him, I hope that this is a bit of a refresher and that you find it interesting. So to start off with, he is a British Orthodox rabbi, philosopher, theologian, and politician. He was educated at Cambridge University, and he pursued postgraduate studies at New College, Oxford, and King's College in London. He garnered 15 honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Divinity conferred by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He served as the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregation of the Commonwealth from 1991 until 2013. He's the spiritual head of the synagogue, the largest synagogue body in the United Kingdom during that time period. And he was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen in 2005 and made a life peer in 2009. Now, just to back up a little bit, that's where he got the title Lord, when he was knighted by Her Majesty. Now, what does peer mean, life peer? Well, obviously he wasn't born into the lineage of the elite in Britain, and so they do confer this title on their peers, and he was chosen in 2009 to be considered a knight of Her Majesty. Let's take a look at the career of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. So, from 1978 to 1982, he was the first rabbinic appointment as the rabbi for the Golder Green Synagogue in London. I knew I was going to mispronounce that. Golders Green, a small town outside of London and predominantly Jewish. In 1983, he became rabbi of the prestigious Marble Arch, a synagogue in central London, a position he held until 1990. Between 1984 and 1990, Sacks also served as principal of Jewish College, the world's oldest rabbinical seminary. Now, Dr. Sacks was inducted to serve as the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth on September 1st, 1991, and he held that position until September 1st in 2013. Sacks became a Knight Bachelor in the Queen's Birthday Honors in 2005 for services to the community and to interfaith relations. He was made an honorary Freeman of the London Borough of Barnet in September of 2006. On July 13th, 2009, the House of Lords appoints him as commission, announced that Sacks was recommended for the life peerage with a seat in the House of Lords, which I explained to you earlier. Because he wasn't born into the lineage to become a nobleman, his peers then provided him with that title in perpetuity in 2009. He took the title Baron Sacks of Aldgate in the City of London, and he sits as a crossbencher. Now, you should probably be taking notes on this so that you can go back, and if any of these titles are unfamiliar to you, you can research it. For time's sake, I can't provide all of the explanations, but I invite you, and I'll give you a second, to grab a pencil and a pad of paper and make some notes for yourself, because it's really interesting learning about all of these different titles, and it's a fascinating process, so different than the United States. Lastly, he was a visiting professor, and continues to be, at universities in Britain, the United States, and Israel. 16 honorary degrees, including a Doctorate of Divinity conferred on him in September of 2001 by then, as I mentioned before, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was George Carey, and this was to mark his first 10 years in office as Chief Rabbi. Now, in recognition for his body of work, which has been absolutely substantial, and if you have internet access, I invite you to Google him and to YouTube him. You'll see numerous lectures, numerous speeches that he's given over the years on a variety of different subjects. Now, he's won several international awards, including the Jerusalem Prize in 1995 for his first contribution to diaspora Jewish life, and the last Ecumenical and Social Concern Award from Gurion University in Israel in 2011. He has written 24 books, receiving the Grawemeyer Prize for Religion in 2004 for the dignity of difference. And I'm going to show you an excerpt from one of his speaking engagements on the dignity of difference. He served as the Ingeborg and Ira Renard Global Distinguished Professor of Judaic Thought at New York University and as the Kressler and Efrat Family University Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University. He was appointed as Professor of Law, Ethics, and the Bible at King's College in London, and he won the Templeton Prize, awarded for his work affirming life's spiritual dimension in 2016, and the Senior Fellow, and the Senior Fellow to the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. These are a mouthful. So I'm going to show you the first, and this is his TED Talk that he did, which really propelled him into a more universal realm. It was a wonderful lecture, and we're going to play it for you now. Sit back, enjoy.
These are the times, said Thomas Paine, that try men's souls. And they're trying ours now. This is a fateful moment in the history of the West. We've seen divisive elections and divided societies. We've seen a growth of extremism in politics and religion, all of it fueled by anxiety, uncertainty, and fear of a world that's changing almost faster than we can bear, and the sure knowledge that it's going to change faster still. I have a friend in Washington. I asked him, what was it like being in America during the recent presidential election? He said to me, well, it was like the man sitting on the deck of the Titanic with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and he's saying, I know I asked for ice. But this is ridiculous. So, is there something we can do, each of us, to be able to face the future without fear? I think there is. And one way into it is to see that perhaps the most simple way into a culture and into an age is to ask, what do people worship? People have worshipped so many different things, the sun, the stars, the storm. Some people worship many gods, some one, some none. In the 19th and 20th centuries, people worshipped the nation, the Aryan race, the communist state. What do we worship? I think future anthropologists will take a look at the books we read on self-help, self-realization, self-esteem. They'll look at the way we talk about morality as being true to oneself, the way we talk about politics as a matter of individual rights. And they'll look at this wonderful new religious ritual we have created. You know the one? Called the selfie. And I think they'll conclude that what we worship in our time is the self, the me, the I. And this is great. It's liberating, it's empowering, it's wonderful. But don't forget that biologically we're social animals. We spent most of our evolutionary history in small groups. We need those face-to-face interactions where we learn the choreography of altruism and where we create those spiritual goods like friendship and trust and loyalty and love that redeem our solitude. When we have too much of the I and too little of the we can find ourselves vulnerable, fearful, and alone. It was no accident that Sherry Turkle of MIT called the book she wrote on the impact of social media Alone Together. So I think the simplest way of safeguarding the future you is to strengthen the future us in 3 dimensions: the us of relationship, the us of identity, and the us of responsibility. So let me first take the us of relationship, and here, forgive me if I get personal. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, I was a 20-year-old undergraduate studying philosophy. I was into Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Sartre and Camus. I was full of ontological uncertainty and existential angst. It was terrific. I was self-obsessed and thoroughly unpleasant to know, until one day I saw across the courtyard a girl who was everything that I wasn't. She radiated sunshine. She emanated joy. I found out her name was Elaine. We met, we talked, we married, and 47 years, 3 children and 8 grandchildren later, I can safely say, was the best decision I ever took in my life, because it's the people not like us that make us grow. And that is why I think we have to do just that. The trouble with Google filters, Facebook friends, and reading the news by narrowcasting rather than broadcasting means that we're surrounded almost entirely by people like us, whose views, whose opinions, whose prejudices even are just like ours. And Cass Sunstein of Harvard has shown that if we surround ourselves with people with the same views as us, we get more extreme. I think we need to renew those face-to-face encounters with the people not like us. I think we need to do that in order to realize that we can disagree strongly and yet still stay friends. It's in those face-to-face encounters that we discover that the people not like us are just people like us. And actually, every time we hold out the hand of friendship to what somebody not like us, whose class or creed or color are different from ours, we heal one of the fractures of our wounded world. That is the us of relationship. Second is the us of identity. Let me give you a thought experiment. Have you been to Washington? Have you seen the memorials? Absolutely fascinating. There's the Lincoln Memorial. Gettysburg Address on one side, second inaugural on the other. You go to the Jefferson Memorial, screeds of text. Martin Luther King Memorial, more than a dozen quotes from his speeches. I didn't realize in America you read memorials. Now go to the equivalent in London in Parliament Square, and you will see that the monument to David Lloyd George contains 3 words: David Lloyd George. Nelson Mandela gets 2, Churchill gets just 1, Churchill. Why the difference? I'll tell you why the difference. Because America was from the outset a nation of wave after wave of immigrants, so it had to create an identity, which it did by telling a story which you learned at school, you read on memorials, and you heard repeated in presidential inaugural addresses. Britain, until recently, wasn't a nation of immigrants, so it could take identity for granted. The trouble is now, the 2 things have happened, which shouldn't have happened together. The first thing is, in the West, we've stopped telling the story of who we are and why, even in America. And at the same time, immigration is higher than it's ever been before. So when you tell a story and your identity is strong, you can welcome the stranger. But when you stop telling the story, your identity gets weak and you feel threatened by the stranger. And that's bad. I tell you, Jews have been scattered and dispersed and exiled for 2,000 years. We never lost our identity. Why? Because at least once a year on the festival of Passover, we told our story and we taught it to our children and we ate the unleavened bread of affliction and tasted the bitter herbs of slavery. So we never lost our identity. I think collectively we've got to get back to telling our story, who we are, where we came from, what ideals by which we live. And if that happens, will become strong enough to welcome the stranger and say, come and share our lives, share our stories, share our aspirations and dreams. That is the us of identity. And finally, the us of responsibility. Do you know something? My favorite phrase in all of politics, very American phrase, is we the people. Why we the people? Because it says that we all share collective responsibility for our collective future. And that's how things really are and should be. Have you noticed how magical thinking has taken over our politics? So we say, all you've got to do is elect this strong leader and he or she will solve all our problems for us. Believe me, that is magical thinking. And then we get the extremes, the far right, the far left, the extreme religious and the extreme anti-religious, the far right dreaming of a golden age that never was, the far left dreaming of a utopia that never will be, and the religious and anti-religious equally convinced that all it takes is God or the absence of God to save us from ourselves. That too is magical thinking, because the only people who will save us from ourselves is we, the people, all of us together. And when we do that, and when we move from the politics of me to the politics of all of us together, we rediscover those beautiful, counterintuitive truths that a nation is strong when it cares for the weak, that it becomes rich when it cares for the poor, it becomes invulnerable when it cares about the vulnerable. That is what makes great nations. So here is my simple suggestion. It might just change your life, and it might just help to begin to change the world. Do a search and replace operation on the text of your mind. And wherever you encounter the word self, substitute the word other. So instead of self-help, other help. Instead of self-esteem, other esteem. And if you do that, you will begin to feel the power of what for me is one of the most moving sentences in all of religious literature. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We can face any future without fear, so long as we know we will not face it alone. So, for the sake of the future you, together, let us strengthen the future us. Thank you.
So I mentioned to you briefly when I was talking about his accolades, one of the books that he wrote called The Dignity of Difference. Now, this book received wonderful reviews, but not without a bit of contention as well. The dignity of difference is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' radical proposal for reconciling hatreds. It's the first major statement by a Jewish leader on the ethics of globalization. It also marks a paradigm shift in the approach to religious coexistence. Sacks argues that we must do more than search for values common to all faiths. We must also reframe the way we see our differences. And I bring to you Rabbi Sacks. Now, interestingly enough, this segment that I'm going to show you was done in Washington, D.C. at the breakfast, at the press breakfast. So give a listen, see what you think.
Wow. This is the first time I've been in a gathering like this. It is amazing. I thank you for the privilege of being with you and for the privilege of being in a room of so many remarkable people who do such great work. And my prayer to God is that He bless all you do. Friends, it's also been a wonderful meal because it has shown me that eating together across faiths can be such fun. The reason I say this is because the first time I had such an occasion turned out to be one of my potentially most embarrassing moments in my life. And I'll tell you the story. One day, soon after I became Chief Rabbi, John Major was the Prime Minister of Britain, 10 Downing Street phoned my office and said, would the Chief Rabbi please join myself for a little meal in 10 Downing Street because we're making a meal for the state visit of the late President of Israel, Chaim Herzog. This is the first time my wife and I had ever been to a little meal like this. And of course, 10 Downing Street made all the arrangements with my office. A very embarrassed official said, will the Chief Rabbi want to eat kosher? To which my office replied, probably. And the next day they phoned up and said, would the Chief Rabbi say grace? And my office said, probably. And the next day a very embarrassed official phoned up and said, do you think you could make it a short grace? Because the Prime Minister has to go off and do something else. So we agreed a short grace. And the day finally came, this very small meal, 16 people in 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Britain, Foreign Secretary, some other cabinet ministers, President of Israel, Chaim Herzog, an Israeli cabinet minister. And we went into the little dining room in 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister stood up and said, I call on the Chief Rabbi to say grace. And it was just then that I discovered that just when you think you have explained everything, there's something you haven't explained. You see, in Jewish law, if you want to make blessing over food, you have to have food in front of you. Did I know it was de rigueur in sophisticated circles in London to sit down to a completely empty table? There was no food in sight, and I couldn't make a blessing, and there was nobody to ask, give me some food. And I was standing there pondering my choice, should I say a blessing that is forbidden in Jewish law, thus taking the Lord's name in vain? Or should I disobey the Prime Minister, thus putting an end to 50 years of Anglo-Israel diplomacy? I lifted mine eyes up to the hills in search of salvation, and salvation came, because one of the officials in 10 Downing Street had decided that morning in a fit of aesthetic enthusiasm that one of the gold table ornaments would look more attractive if it were draped with a bunch of grapes. This was the only food in the entire room. So I said a grace that included grapes and everything else, ate a grape, and honor was satisfied. After the meal, I went up to the Prime Minister and said, Prime Minister, you must understand that your faith is different from ours. In fact, you have more faith than we do. Because you are prepared to thank the Lord for that which we are about to receive. But we, after long historical experience, prefer to have received it first. life is encountering difference and diversity. Think about it. Walk down any city street in any Western society, and you will encounter in 1 hour more religious, cultural, and ethnic diversity than an 18th century anthropologist would have encountered in an entire lifetime. This is an amazing thing. Every school I go into London has between 40 and 60 ethnic groups within its student body. It is stunning. Never before have we been so close to so much difference. But the real question is, do we see this as a good thing or not a good thing? Now, my answer to that is very simple. Look at the world God created. He didn't create one kind of tree, he created 200,000 kinds of tree. He didn't create one form of life, but 3 million forms of life. He did not create one language, but 6,000 kinds of language. The miracle of monotheism is that unity up there creates diversity down here. But everything is challenging like this, and the main thing depends on whether we feel threatened or enlarged by difference. So after 9/11, I wrote a book called The Dignity of Difference, just to make that point in religious terms. But you don't have to make it in religious terms only. You can make it in secular terms. I discovered after my historical research that countries and cultures that embraced diversity went on to greatness. Those that suppressed diversity went on to decline. Anyone who has read James Suwecki's famous book, The Wisdom of Crowds, or Cass Sunstein's book, Why Societies Need Dissent, knows that the same applies to businesses, to economies, and indeed to religions. Judaism, like Christianity and Islam, is full of diversity. One of the things I admire the people who put the Hebrew Bible together is that they put in it such dissident words. Ecclesiastes, Job, remarkable. They wanted to hear the counter voice. They wanted to hear more than one voice. And that has been the case ever since. In Israel, where there's a certain divide between religious and secular, I wanted to show that we can talk together with mutual respect. And so I had a public discussion with the secular Israeli novelist Amos Oz. And I will never forget his opening sentence. It is one of the most Jewish sentences I ever heard. He said, I don't think I'm going to agree with Rabbi Sachs about everything, but then on most things I don't agree with myself. And of course the Quran celebrates the fact that God created many nations so that we may know one another, and the gospel embraces Jew and Greek, slave and free man, man and woman. This is what made Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the great forces that they are. And the basis of this spiritually is that resonant line in the first chapter of the Bible, when God says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Because if we believe that, then the greatest religious challenge is, can I see God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose color or cultural pride. And that is the challenge. The rabbis said it beautifully in the Mishnah. They said, when you mint many coins in the same mint, they all come out identical. God makes every one of us in the same mold, in his image, yet we all come out different. That's what makes it absolutely fundamental. Now, today, we face a great challenge, because there is hardly a nation in the world that is not growing less tolerant of diversity. In country after country, we see different religious and ethnic minorities that were once friends and of today are hardly talking to one another. And we are in danger of forgetting the fundamental religious truth that the rabbis summed up in the words, Ezehu Gibor, who is a hero, not one who defeats his enemies, but one who turns an enemy into a friend. Friends, we are all children of Abraham. And if we are children of Abraham, then there is one scene engraved in our minds. That scene in Genesis 18 where three strangers pass by and Abraham rushes to offer them hospitality. Listen, I know all of you would do this, but don't forget, he was 99 years old and he had just had his circumcision. But the thing is, as we all know from the end of the story, those three strangers turned out to be angels. And the fact is that the Bible is telling us something very simple. If you treat people like angels, they become angels. But if you treat them like enemies, they will become enemies. Let us treat our friends and strangers as angels. Friends, think about this. We are defined as a humanity by our commonalities and our differences. If we were completely different, we wouldn't be able to communicate. But if we were all exactly the same, we'd have nothing to say. And that is how we have to do it. Strive to find our common humanity and then celebrate our differences. So let us thank God that we have these differences. And every time we embrace somebody of a different faith or culture or experience, our world is enlarged. Let us strive to see the trace of God in the face of a stranger, and we will create the beautiful future God wants us to create. Amen.
Anti-Semitism, he has argued, is fundamentally dislike of the unlike. Jews have insisted on the right to be different, and that it is what has made anti-Semitism the world's oldest hatred. Thus, the necessity of recognizing the dignity of difference, the title of his most successful and controversial book. Controversial because, as I mentioned, in its first edition, it claimed that God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, and Islam to Muslim. Now, following its publication, he was summoned to a gathering of 20 fellow Orthodox rabbis in Manchester, who duly charged him with heresy and called for a retraction of that comment. Now, a second edition was published with the offering of the offending passages redacted. Unconvincingly, Lord Sachs called for clarification rather than a retraction. Now, we're going to hear a little bit about something a little bit more contemporary that's hitting us hard right now. Speaking to the BBC in this interview, Rabbi Sachs talks about the coronavirus.
Lord Sachs, you've talked a lot about the I versus the we, the individual versus the community spirit. That suddenly got an awful lot harder with the restrictions put upon us.
No, I think exactly the opposite. Bad events like the coronavirus, the worst, certainly in my lifetime, do sometimes bring out the worst in us, but they also bring out the best. Right now, in communities across the country, there are groups of people circulating, elderly and vulnerable people saying, "Can I help?" Supermarkets are gearing up to provide basic supplies. Young people are preparing to deliver medicines to people in need. It's a little like the wartime spirit, and we'll see more and more of this as time goes on. We are going to see a renewal of the we of the country.
Except that coming together is partly metaphorical now, because we can't come together, we can't be a community, we can't reach out and touch and hug in that same way. We're told to self-isolate if we feel the need. That is also pulling us apart.
It is physically pulling us apart. Of course, right now, the social media, about which I have sometimes critical things to say, is going to connect us together. People are going to stay in touch. I think it's very important for us to reach out to people who are on their own, phone them or FaceTime them or what have you. And I do think that this split attention with everyone looking at something different that has so disaggregated us as a culture is going to change, because we're all pretty much watching the same news, reacting in pretty much the same way. So although we're physically not together, mentally and emotionally, I think we will be.
We're talking a lot at the moment about the greater good. It's a phrase that we think we understand, but it's harder in practice. We are tribes, we are families, we are units first and foremost. I wonder if you have to recognise that inevitably people will think about their loved ones before they think about the wider arena.
We're all part of circles. There's a narrow circle of family, then community, then society, then nation, then the larger family of nations. There are ranges of circles, but right now I don't know when we've been more embraced, every one of us in a vital and personal way, with this huge circle of humanity. I don't know when all the countries of the world have simultaneously faced the same danger. Just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we could say this is happening to someone else, somewhere else, a half a world away. All of a sudden, it's now affecting every one of us. So I think that physical isolation is nonetheless going to go hand in hand with emotional and even moral sense of solidarity.
But on a very practical level, a lot of us are now wrestling with what we say to elderly parents. Do we forbid them from socialising, from having their friends round, from coming over to our houses because it's imperative to follow these government guidelines? Or do we listen to their needs and their wishes first?
The art here is to try and do both at the same time as far as you can. Sometimes I'm going to have to see my grandchildren via WhatsApp or FaceTime or Facebook. And I'm going to miss seeing them directly, but I still love their smile when my daughter sends me the photographs. I think I'm going to phone my family every day if they'll put up with it, because I never used to do that. We used to rely on seeing each other once a week. I think it's very important not to expose our family to unnecessary risks. We're going to come through this, whether it takes 3 months or 6 months or even more, we'll come through it safe and alive. And I think that is the most important thing.
There will be some very elderly people or very frail people thinking, there's a chance I won't make it through this. I wouldn't see the year out anyway. And I prefer to spend time with my children, with my grandchildren, than being left on my own and being told what's good for me. What would your response be to that, to them?
Keep them 6 feet away.
So
if that is a dying wish, God forbid, then it's very, very hard to deny that without being inhuman, and I think one would regret it for all one's days. But there are ways of doing that at a distance that minimize the risk, and that's what we're going to have to do. We cannot allow the old, the frail, the vulnerable to feel completely abandoned, completely alone. We cannot do that. So to the extent that the phone call will do or the distant visit will do, we have to do that. At the end of the day, though, you can't finally say no, but you can do it with a minimum of risk.
You will be called upon in the weeks and months to conduct funerals that you would probably never have thought that you would be doing. How do you make that safe and also humane? How do you make sure that people aren't seeing their relatives dying alone or buried alone?
I did it just 2 days ago. And I have to say it's heartbreaking. We had a very, very small attendance at the funeral. Everyone very careful to keep their distance. And this was somebody who died who would have had many, many hundreds. And obviously the family was heartbroken, not just at the grief, but this inability for others to join in that grief. But they know perfectly well that they had to restrict it. And to say, when all this is over, we will remember and we will come together. And this is not something that's going to last forever.
Our generation, my generation, has not lived through war or famine or privation in this country. Our young have been called snowflakes. Do you think that we are unprepared for this challenge?
I think there is something within us. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. That makes us social animals, that makes us feel better when we are altruistic, when we help others, when we make someone else's life better. So I think we're going to be tried, as the nation was tried during World War II. But thank heavens, not through war, not through terror. I mean, this is awful, but it could have been so much more awful. And we are going to come through this with young people and every single individual who lives through it, feeling a much stronger sense of identification with others, a much stronger commitment to helping others who need help. This, in a tragic way, is probably the lesson we needed as a nation and as a world.
Do you think it will fundamentally change our character and our generation?
I think so. I don't think anyone who thinks hard about how one tiny microscopic virus has brought the whole of humanity to its knees can be indifferent to nature anymore. So this is going to make us more sensitive to issues like climate change. I don't think that we will be able to maintain the degree of globalization of the economy that we've had before. How can we rely entirely on outsourcing our manufacturing to China, outsourcing our pharmaceuticals to India? We're going to have to become more self-reliant as nations, and that's going to benefit an awful lot of people who've been left behind by globalization. So I think there are good consequences that are going to come out of this. It's just a matter of maintaining our courage, our confidence, and our hope till we're through it.
Have you been surprised by how people have responded to this so far, be it the stockpiling of groceries or the altruism towards neighbours? Does human nature still have the power to surprise you?
I think the stockpiling was really surprising and pretty distressing, to be honest with you. I mean, to say, I am only concerned with me and my family, let the rest of the world perish. That's just morally unacceptable, and I'm pretty sure the supermarkets will put an end to it quite soon. If not, then the government will have to introduce rationing of certain goods, I have no doubt. But the goodness of people has not surprised me at all, because out of crisis, human nature always tends to goodness, to help. I gave the example in my book of that little town of Gander in Newfoundland, where all the aeroplanes were diverted after 9/11, and this tiny little town of 10,000 people became a town of 10,000 heroes and saints. And now that's all of us. So the good never surprises me, the bad sometimes does.
When you talk of towns of heroes and saints, I grew up on the doorstep of Eyam in Derbyshire. It's known as the Plague Village. The vicar called together his parishioners and said, we've got the plague, no one's going to leave, we're all going to die here together. Do you think that kind of selflessness, I mean, not the NHS staff, clearly, who are on the front line, who are doing this every day of their lives, but do you think in a community way, that kind of selflessness still exists?
Well, I don't think we need that kind of selflessness. For heaven's sake, we are so much more medically advanced than we were. The last time there was a pandemic of this kind was 100 years ago. We don't know how many people died in the Spanish flu epidemic, between 20 million and 50 million. I think we are just much more medically advanced than now, and I don't think that kind of self-sacrifice in the literal sense of dying for others is going to be demanded of us.
But I guess what I'm saying is that in those days, 400 years ago, or maybe 100 years ago, there was a sense of being God-fearing. Now we're majority atheist. I wonder where that sense of duty comes from, if it's not a fear of God.
Well, I think that, first of all, after all, in Judaism, God tells us, choose life. He doesn't say die for the sake of others. He says, choose life, which is why so many Jews become doctors, among other things. But I think the second thing is that this is the nearest we have to a revelation, even to atheists. Here we suddenly see our vulnerability. We've been coasting along for more than half a century in unprecedented affluence, unprecedented freedom, unprecedented optimism. And all of a sudden we are facing the fragility and vulnerability of the human situation. And at the end of the day, even without a faith in God, we have to say, either we work together and survive, or we work separately and perish.
So that revelation is what then?
A revelation of the inescapably interlinked nature of our humanity, the covenant of human solidarity, the thing that makes each of us not only an I, but part of the greater human we.
Do you think that society has been ahead of the government on this one? People have been more prepared to make more sacrifices than perhaps our leaders thought we would.
It's absolutely true, and I think incredibly reassuring. Isn't it remarkable that people are saying to the government, be more tough with us, ban X, Y, and Z that you haven't already banned, or at least you haven't formally done so. I think the public has responded exceptionally well. I mean, the real heroes here are the doctors and nurses, the medical experts, the scientists, but the general public has also emerged as a hero, putting the common good ahead of individual interests.
So who do you think globally is providing the leadership right now? I mean, David Miliband suggested it was China now, that, they had learned the lessons and they were trying to share that with us. Do you think of China now being the world leader here?
No, I don't. I think the West still has something very special in terms of... Don't forget, I'm arguing for a balance between I and we. China emphasizes the we a great deal more than we would ever do. We're a liberal democracy. China is not a liberal democracy. I think the leader here is humanity. This is the remarkable, unexpected, unpredictable thing that regardless of governments, because governments have not particularly been helping one another, all the European states have been turning inward and asking what's right for us, not what's right for Europe as a whole. There has not necessarily been the highest quality of political leadership, but there has been an overall sense that I pick up everywhere. Nobody's protested the restrictions. Even in countries that have been much stricter than Britain, no one has protested.
Does that make you think twice? Does it make you reevaluate bigger questions then about political leadership and democracy? When you look to totalitarian societies like China, or to some extent Singapore, to what you call the we countries rather than the I countries, does it make you think, actually, we need more of that?
We need more of that, but we need not go the whole way. Otherwise, we would lose what is unique about the West. Only the West gave rise to this concept of the sanctity of the individual, and with it, liberal democracy. The matter is a matter of balance.
Have we had too much liberal democracy?
We've had too much individualism, too much liberal democracy, and too little concern for the collective of the nation and of humanity as a whole.
Have we talked too much about rights?
We have talked far too much about rights and far too little about responsibilities. And what we are seeing is people being willing to handle their responsibilities. And I don't know why we let it slip out of the discourse, because it's an essential part. Without responsibilities, in the end, you'll find you have no rights.
I used to live in the Far East, and they talked about Asian values there. Leaders like Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew talked about Asian values, responsibilities over rights. And I remember that being quite dismissed then, as if it was the workings of a totalitarian government. Do you think they were right? Do you think Asian values are right about humanity when it comes to a crisis?
Well, in certain respects, they are now ahead of us. Let's be clear. China led everyone else until the 16th century. Then the West got liberal democracy, the beginnings of it at any rate, liberalism in the form of John Milton and John Locke, and then with Adam Smith, the market economy. And so the West eventually pulled way, way ahead of China. Today you have a situation in which the West, until now, has been losing its way. Too much individualism, too little collective responsibility. So right now China is pulling ahead, Singapore is pulling ahead. Look at the examination results of children in Singapore schools. Because there they emphasize responsibility and discipline and not just self-esteem, whereas Britain and America have been falling down on those educational league tables.
That's not about morality, that's about how hard you work the kids.
Yeah, it's about responsibility, it's about discipline, it's about punishment, it's about all sorts of stuff that is pretty moral. And we threw all of that out of the educational system in the name of self-esteem. So I think there are respects in which we're going to have to say, let's look at the way other cultures do things. But I don't think now is the time to turn our back on our own culture, because I do think we will emerge from this in the fullness of time as a stronger culture, a stronger country, with a stronger sense of collective identity and responsibility.
And you've talked about silver linings throughout the course of this interview. Do you think you will look back and be able to spot the pre-corona and the post-corona Britain, British identity?
We will never forget this period. The way, people never forgot the Second World War. I don't know how my parents kept remembering that war as if that was such a vivid moment in their lives. But they did. Because when you do face a danger and you face it together with lots of other people, it becomes incredibly vivid and personality shaping in terms of your memory. So I think this is going to change every one of us. And hard though it is to say so and see it today, we will look back and say we emerged better people as a result of this.
Lord Sachs, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In concluding, I wanted to leave you with two quotes, two of the many quotes that you can take from so many of his writings and his books, his sermons, and lectures. The test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not my image? Who can language, faith, ideal, or different than mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing Him to remake me in His. I'm going to say that again and read it along with me. And if you have your pen, pencil, and paper handy, this is a good one to remind us. The test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideal are different than mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing Him to make me in his. That out of the dignity of difference on how to avoid the clash of civilizations. And in concluding this last quote, God has given many faiths, but only one world in which to coexist. May your work help all of us to cherish our commonalities and feel enlarged by our differences. Again, in this time of coronavirus, please take these words to heart, as I'm sure so many of you have done with your years of wisdom. Pass them along to your children, your grandchildren. Discuss them on the phone or in Skype or FaceTime. Commit to being together by reaching out by phone or some of these other applications, as I mentioned. God has given us many faiths, but only one world in which to coexist. May your work help all of us to cherish our commonalities and feel enlarged by our differences. I hope that today this has given you a moment to pause, to think about some of his words, to do further studies, to get his books. You're able to by Amazon. And I would encourage you, if you're so inclined, to give it thought, ponder it, and talk, as I said, to your children and to your grandchildren. Now more than ever, we need to be as one, though we're separate. This is a message that you just heard. I thank you all. On behalf of the programming team, I want to thank you for being with us, for encouraging us, for your comments and your thoughts. We're working hard to make this a lifeline for you, and we're wishing you all the best in health and safety. I'm Bonnie Eads, member of the programming staff. God bless, and thank you.